Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today. I want to welcome you to the Infant Nutrition Science Coalition's second roundtable discussion. I'm Vanessa Castagna, Director of Food Safety and Claims at Scientific, a company that brings together scientific experts from around the world to provide objective, peer-reviewed guidance on complex regulatory and safety questions. I'm pleased to be with you today on behalf of the INSC for what will surely be a robust and lively scientific roundtable discussion regarding the use of the term bioactive in infant nutrition. Before I jump into today's session, I have a few housekeeping notes to share. Today's session is being recorded and will be posted to our website in the coming days. Throughout the session, we'll be asking for your participation. We have integrated a few real-time polling questions for your input. When prompted, please click on the link provided and add your response. Additionally, we'll have several places where we will pause for questions from the audience. Please feel free to type your questions at any time in the box titled Q&A, not the chat box. Please note that due to our limited time today, we might not be able to get to everybody's questions, but we do have a moderator who is the host of our first roundtable discussion, Tricia Mishler from Reckitt, reviewing questions and providing them to our panelists in real time. I want to take a moment to thank the INSC members who helped plan and organize this session with me. Paul Hanlon from Abbott Nutrition, Tim Lambers from Friesland Campina, and Gyan Rai from Nara Organics, along with our INSC administrators, Cypress Lynx and Stefan Vidri from ILSI US and Canada. Lastly, a resounding thank you to Scientific for sponsoring pre-event discussions and a follow-up poll that will be sent to you, our audience participants, to capture your thoughts on the discussion topic and ruminations of our panelists. Please be on the lookout for an invitation to join the Scientific expert community and share your thoughts on the INSC poll. Next slide, please. For those who are unfamiliar with the INSC, we are a tripartite initiative that brings together scientific experts from academia, government, and industry to advance research on human milk and infant nutrition. The INSC aims to improve our understanding of human milk composition and functional effects, and to explore how differences between human milk and infant formula may impact infant development. For more information, please visit our website at inscoalition.org. Next slide, please. At INSC, we have three key focus areas. Number one, examining comparative composition of human milk and infant formula and ensuring accurate data collection methods. Number two, understanding the physiological effects of human milk and infant formula components and identifying valid preclinical models, including animal models and new alternative methods. And number three, developing comprehensive infant health markers beyond traditional growth measurements. Next slide. So you may be wondering, why are we discussing the use of the term bioactive for infant nutrition? Human milk is a complex biofluid that contains a huge number of unique substances. And it can be beneficial to categorize these in different ways, including regarding the function they have. Aligning on the different terms can lead to improved understanding of appropriate safety evaluations, research priorities, and suitability determinations. However, the term bioactive is not clearly defined, and yet the use of it holds significant implications. Today, we brought together experts across our tripartite sectors to discuss these implications and how we can better align on the use of this hot button term. Next slide, please. I'd like to briefly introduce today's expert panelists. As a reminder, full bios are available on our website. Please note the views expressed by our panelists are their own and do not represent their current or previous affiliations. Dr. Dennis Keefe is currently a senior managing scientist at Exponent, and he was previously the director of the Office of Food Additive Safety at the FDA. He brings to us today the perspective of that government agency he once directed, though again, today his views are his own. Dr. Paul Hanlon is the Regulatory Affairs Director at Abbott Nutrition and is co-chair of the INSC Steering Committee. He brings today the perspective of the finished goods industry in infant nutrition. Dr. Menki Ho works for Novonesis and is responsible for regulatory submissions for a diverse range of ingredients, particularly those in infant nutrition. Her views come from the ingredient industry. And finally, but absolutely not least, Dr. Sharon Donovan is the Melissa M. Noel Endowed Chair in Nutrition and Health at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and is a co-chair of the INSC Steering Committee. Dr. Donovan enlightens us with the perspective of a scientific researcher from the academic community. Thank you to our panelists for joining us today. And next slide. So in preparation for this discussion, our panelists were asked this question: what do you hope to achieve with this roundtable discussion, and what outcomes can we reach? Although there was much discussion, the most aligned answers were these two. Number one, increased awareness of unique perspectives from academia, regulatory bodies, and industry on the impact of the term bioactive. And second, alignment on recommendations for when the term bioactive is best used, appropriate or inappropriate. And I will add from one survey participant, to get everyone to agree to avoid the misleading term bioactive. Perhaps that's an aspirational goal. The next slide, please. So we're going to start today's talk with two published definitions on this hot phrase. First, from our own FDA regulators. Bioactive ingredients are synthetic or non-human milk-derived ingredients that may mimic components typically present in human milk, and that are not traditionally considered essential nutrients, but are hypothesized to have physiological activity. These ingredients are intended to be added to infant formula, either alone or in combination, with awareness of the hypothesized biological activity, and may include microbiome projects such as live microbes, microbial constituents, and products of microbial metabolism. And a second definition from Health Canada. A bioactive substance is a substance that is demonstrated or purported to have favorable effects on health. In the context of food, bioactive substances include nutrients and non-nutrients that may be inherent in or added to food. Note the emphasis I've added to differentiate some key phrases in each definition. So let's turn to our panelists for comments. I'm going to start if Dennis has arrived. Looks like he might not be on yet. So let's turn to Menki.
Sure. Thanks, Vanessa. And just to start off, thanks for the invitation to participate in this panel today. I'm really looking forward to the discussions and again, to reiterate, the voices and opinions that are reflected here today are just mine and not necessarily of no one else's. But in terms of this slide that you have up, Vanessa, I think, looking at the two definitions, one of them clearly calls out essential nutrients as not as part of the definition of a bioactive, and the other one does include essential nutrients. And I think we can get into that later on in the roundtable. But the other part that you've highlighted here too is that one is a little bit maybe treading carefully here and saying that they are hypothesized to have a physiological activity, whereas the other suggests that there's a demonstrated or purported favorable effect. I mean, personally, I prefer to lean towards the second one, as I think it's a little bit more prescriptive in that, it's based on the assumption that these substances are doing something good. It's a hypothesis-driven development, and there are reasons to believe that these components would be doing something good at their intended usages when added into formula products. And the fact that it's demonstrated or purported means you could have a lot of good scientific evidence, or it could be a little bit still at the hypothesis evidence generating type of stage.
Thanks for that, Maggie. Paul, thoughts from you?
Yeah, and I'll echo Mankey's statement of, thanking everyone for inviting me to participate in this panel. I think it is going to be a great discussion. So I think I'm going to comment a little bit on some of the elements that are maybe not captured in either of these definitions. And so I'm a food toxicologist, and that's the perspective and the hat that I'm going to be wearing during this discussion. And what is written here is talking about what might be the inherent properties of that substance. But I think it's really important to consider the context of what that definition means in terms of what then flows out from the consequence of defining something as bioactive or not. as a food toxicologist, when we're evaluating the safety of food ingredients, we're always doing a case-by-case assessment of what is the potential physiological effects of an ingredient on a mammalian system. So, and I'm going to give some examples, I think, later on where we're talking about that. For me, one of the other things that maybe is not captured within these definitions is how I typically think about ingredients that are in infant formula. And I find it useful to talk about it in maybe three big buckets. One is the essential nutrients, which are called out in both of these definitions. A second category are technological food additives, things that may have an effect in the product itself, but are not added for the purpose of having an effect in the individuals consuming them, things like antioxidants, stabilizers, emulsifiers. And then a third category is, I think, maybe what some of these definitions are hinting at, which is other things that may be added to infant formula that are not an essential nutrient, meaning you will not have a gross deficiency if they're not there, but are added to bring infant formula closer to the composition and therefore hopefully function of infant formula, bringing it closer to the gold standard for infant nutrition, which is human milk.
Thank you, Paul. And I'm sure we're going to hear a lot of those terms repeated many times over in the upcoming discussions. And Sharon?
Yeah, it's always great to follow the other speakers. I think that I actually lean towards the first one a bit more because it is focused more specifically on human milk and infant formula. And it's interesting, if you search, the term bioactive substance is broadly used. We're using it for human milk, but you can see it's used. Health Canada, NCI uses it quite a bit. ILSI has whole groups working on this. So I think that as we move forward, if we're going to use bioactivity for human milk and infant formulas, we need to tighten up our definitions and be more specific in what we're implying. I guess from my perspective, I also don't consider these bioactives that traditionally are not the essential nutrients, in that infants don't show any sort of classic deficiency sign if lactoferrin or MFGM or HMOs are not in that formula, but they may show benefits. So kind of what Menke said, benefits if they are there. I guess as I was looking at this again, personally, I wouldn't include the microbiome products, such as live microbes, because I think that opens up a whole nother area. We basically know very little about the human milk microbiome, and most of the probiotics that have been added to infant formula are not native to either human milk nor the infant gut. So later we're going to talk about the term suitability. And so I think that as we start to weave in, yes, is there bioactivity? Is it a component of human milk? We need to consider all of these things together. But I guess I would throw my hat a little bit more in the first definition, because I in my mind have not considered these essential nutrients.
I guess just following that note, what is wrong with considering essential nutrients as bioactive substances? To any of our panelists. Sharon, back to you, I guess.
Well, I guess because, I really I think about essential nutrients that are, if we leave this out of an infant formula, that infant is not going to thrive. So I guess I'm more clearly going on the essential definition that we have in nutrition. I do think it also brings up potential, testing and regulatory issues, but I'm going to leave that to the experts.
Paul, back to you on that one.
Yeah, and I think it comes in that, what is the purpose of assigning something the name bioactive? So if we're talking about safety, I don't think it helps anything, because any substance, whether it is being added as a essential nutrient or a technological additive or an optional ingredient, like, you're still always going to be assessing whether or not those ingredients are having some sort of physiological effect. So is that bioactivity? I think the other thing that adds complexity is that you have a number of substances that could actually kind of bridge a number of those categories. So I'm going to be giving the example of ascorbyl palmitate. So it is an additive used as an antioxidant, but it is also a source of vitamin C. So are we going to be talking, is it something that is bioactive because it's a source of vitamin C, like only if the definition of bioactive includes essential nutrients? Again, I think a lot of it depends on that purpose of why are we defining something as bioactive.
Well, it looks like we already have your slide up here, Paul. So I think we're just gonna jump right in here. Let me just make a note that our other panelist, I think, is trying to join right now. That's Dennis Keefe, our regulatory perspective. But in the meantime, we're going to jump into these slides that we've asked our panelists to put together just to kind of make a little bit more of an emphasis on their position and their thoughts on bioactive. So, Paul, you're already jumping in here. So why don't you just complete this slide?
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. So with my slide, what I wanted to do is give a historical perspective and also a perspective from an agency outside the U.S. So this is not a new issue, looking at the safety and how do you evaluate the safety of ingredients that are going to be added to infant formula. So back in 1971, probably before a lot of us here on the call were doing anything with human milk or infant formula, JECFA published this report that said that there was a need to develop a more systematic approach for evaluating the safety of infant formula ingredients. For those of you who don't know JECFA, it is a joint task force that is managed by both the WHO and the FAO. And the risk assessors that sit on the JECFA risk assessment panels are made up of risk assessors from regulatory agencies around the world. So US FDA, Health Canada, EFSA, et cetera. Those are the risk assessors that participate in these panels. It actually took them a long time from 1971 to get to a place where they started to do these infant-specific evaluations. So part of it was developing the frameworks. I think we'll probably talk a lot on this call about a framework that was developed by the Institute of Medicine in 2004, looking at evaluation of safety of infant formula ingredients. But there's some other guidance documents that are also out there. But since 2014, JECFA has actually evaluated 8 additives that are used in infant formula. And they've been using these very specific infant assessments to do that evaluation. I've got up on the screen 2 different examples that I think kind of nicely show how this case-specific evaluation of additives and other ingredients in infant formula is always conducted. And I picked these because we have one example that is clearly not a bioactive, and then we have the ascorbyl palmitate example that I talked about that kind of has this bridge between the 2 different categories. So when we were doing the evaluation for xanthan gum, when JECFA was doing the evaluation, the first question that comes up is, what is xanthan gum? And what is the most reasonable way? What are the reasonable ways that it may interact with the physiological systems of an infant? So you start by the characterization of what is this ingredient. And xanthan gum is this really big polymer that is used as a stabilizer thickener, mostly in products that are either made of hydrolyzed proteins or amino acids. It's gigantic. It is something that is not absorbed. It's also something that is not metabolized by the infant. And therefore, since it's not being absorbed, the reasonable interactions that xanthan gum is going to have in a mammalian model is the gastrointestinal tract. So with xanthan gum, what ended up doing is we created this safety package to support the safety of this ingredient. And it started with this traditional toxicology study in which we fed rats xanthan gum, 1 gram of xanthan gum per kilogram body weight of the rat for 2 years, and it exhibited no effect. And that is a standard way that we are conducting these toxicology studies, where you are feeding a mammalian model a really, really high concentration. And this is to do 2 things. It's to really look at those things that you may predict may have an effect of that additive, but it's really a non-targeted screening as well. You're trying to look for anything that you may not have even predicted, and you're measuring all sorts of endpoints in all different organs, looking at microscopic, macroscopic inspection of tissues, clinical chemistry, anything that you may have expected and things that you don't expect. And the other thing here is you're looking at concentrations that far exceed what would be expected in a human condition. So if you translate this one, actually the 750 milligram per kilogram body weight, into what an infant is exposed to, that would be like feeding a 10-pound bag of flour or a bowling ball to a 6-kilogram infant every day. So it's really an incredible amount of xanthan gum that was fed to both the rats and then the piglets in the other study. So after doing this very broad traditional toxicology study for xanthan gum, that we also incorporated a study specific for infants. Again, targeting the reasonable places, the reasonable mechanisms through which it may have a physiological effect. So does it have a bioactivity or physiological effect? If it did, it would be having it on the GI tract. We selected the neonatal piglet model. Piglets are a really great model for infant gastrointestinal development. So these are 2-day-old piglets that were then fed for 21 days with xanthan gum. And again, we saw no adverse effects in that model. So we took what we knew about xanthan gum. We evaluated the reasonable endpoints through which it may interact. And we were very satisfied that the data that was generated through these models demonstrated the safety of this ingredient. Ascorbyl palmitate is a little bit different, and it gets a little bit closer to that bioactive because ascorbyl palmitate does dissociate into vitamin C, which certainly has physiological effects within the infant. So here, designing that safety package to support the safety of ascorbyl palmitate was a little different. We still started with that really broad, non-targeted assay, feeding rats for 2 years with up to 125 mg per kg body weight of ascorbyl palmitate. Again, that translates to about 1 pineapple or a large loaf of bread if you're considering a 6-kilogram infant. So again, it's an absurd amount of this additive that would be fed to these rats. And the important study for ascorbyl palmitate, again, considering what that ingredient is, case by case, what is the most reasonable way it's going to be having, or all the reasonable ways it's going to be having an effect. And here it is, are we talking about the infant being exposed to ascorbyl palmitate, or is ascorbyl palmitate being metabolized into those components, ascorbic acid and palmitic acid, which are inherent components within lots of other ingredients within the infant formula? So we had that specific study that was conducted that demonstrated that there was complete dissociation of ascorbyl palmitate, even under conditions of infant digestion. So we know that it's dissociating. And then also on top of that, when you compare that to the amount of ascorbic acid or palmitic acid that's already present in formula, it's really just a small portion of it. So if we have no concerns of the safety of vitamin C or palmitic acid, there's really no reason to consider that this would be having a safety concern. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. We're going to go back to listen to Dennis Keefe, who's joined us. Dennis, are you able?
Let me get off. Am I off mute?
Yeah, we're
Can
good.
you hear me? Okay, good. Sorry. I'm driving and I apologize. I got my timing confused. My bad. So I want to talk just a little bit about how FDA develops policies and sort of just a general basis for how FDA works and looks at new or evolving issues. So I don't know if you can see on my slide, there's in the watermark, there's a 3-legged stool that has each of the legs is labeled, and I don't know if the labeling is coming through, but one leg is the law, one leg is science, and one leg is policy. And the law is the foundation of what FDA uses to make decisions. The law has definitions, and I've put a couple of definitions up on the slide just for illustration purposes. And the law, doesn't change that often. It might be interpreted in the courts and changed a little bit in how it's applied. It also can be amended, but those amendments are, every 10 years, every 20 years. It's not that often. The law is reflecting what the cultural values are and what the society thinks is important in terms of regulating what FDA does. The other key here, and the law, so the definitions I put up there, for example, when we're thinking about bioactives and applications to infant formula, the FDA is going to look at definitions. So the food additive definition. The other definition is for grass, and we got infant formula. During the decision-making process of the policy development, FDA lawyers and scientists are parsing the words in these definitions to understand where the agency can do what the agency can do and how best to apply the law. Now, there's no definition in the law for bioactive. There's no definition for obesogens. There's no definition for nutraceuticals. These are all words, phrases, expressions that have been developed, but they don't have any specific legal definition. Now, the science is critical to FDA's decision-making process, and the science drives the policy, and the science is interpreted within the context of the law to develop policy. Now, the science is the one part of the decision-making of the policy development that evolves with time as science advances. So, for example, what I'm most experienced with was in the food additive space is when back in the 1990s, we developed a policy based on the Food Additives Amendment for foods derived from genetically engineered plants. There was no amendment to the law, but the agency developed a policy and a process and a framework for evaluating those new foods derived from those new varieties of plants. Similarly, in the last few years, the FDA developed policy using the best available science and the law to develop policies around the foods derived from cell-cultured meats. So in terms of bioactive and the use of bioactives and FDA's policy development around the use of these ingredients or this phraseology, they're going to be looking at the definitions of food ingredients and then also in infant formula in terms of how they will regulate substances that are labeled as bioactive or characterized as bioactive. Absent any statutory changes to define what bioactives are. So for FDA, bioactives is a fanciful name. It really has no meaning for them from a regulatory perspective. I know this has meaning for some in the infant formula space and other spaces in terms of food, but it has no meaning for FDA in terms of how they develop policy. And those are the ends of my comments.
Thanks, Dennis. I'm sure we have some comments from panelists on your position or the thoughts you're reflecting on here, but we're going to go and listen to our other two panelists first before we open this up to a full roundtable discussion. Menki.
Sure. Yeah, so in my intro slide here and kind of tying off of what Dennis had just said, like I put the quote from Shakespeare here, what's in a name? I think we're getting a bit bogged down on terminologies and what they mean and putting labels on things. I think it's more important to focus on the key attributes that underlie the concept of a bioactive and what that operationally means when it comes to scientific research and regulatory policies. And in the context of infant nutrition, I think the bioactives concept in its core essence captures substances that are mimicking components ordinarily present in human milk and have a demonstrated or purported favorable effect on health. So, as Paul mentioned very nicely, there are already guidelines that are in place to evaluate substances that are intentionally added into infant formula, regardless of whether they are technological aids or new forms of essential nutrients or even a bioactive. And following these same established frameworks, various substances that would be so-called bioactives, like DHA, HMOs, many others as well, they have undergone evaluation by authoritative bodies and been concluded as safe and have been cleared for market in infant formula globally. And I'm going to try to keep this short here just so that, as I know we have a lot to talk about. But lastly, I do want to highlight that the evaluation of substances that are intentionally added into infant formula will always come with some degree of unknown, regardless of what they are. Risk is not an absolute concept, and we all know that human milk composition is incredibly complex and dynamic. And even for the classical essential nutrients, our understanding of their roles and recommended inclusion rates into infant formula, that does change over time as more data becomes available. And so I'm ending the slide here with a question that I think really kicked off this INSC initiative. What are the fundamental questions that need to be addressed before bioactive ingredients are included in an infant formula? And I think when it comes to bioactives, simply saying more research is needed is not all that helpful. I mean, research funding is limited, and the goal of scientific research is not to eliminate all questions, but research tends to add to the collective understanding that inevitably leads to more research being done, is because that raises more questions. And so to make meaningful advances in infant nutrition, I think there needs to be a pragmatic and systematic way of looking at these substances.
Excellent, Mikey. Thank you. I think we're going to come back to that question once we hear from Sharon. So let's bookmark that. And Sharon?
Yeah, so again, I'm kind of providing the academic researcher perspective and someone who's studied human milk and lactation and for 40 years. And again, we know that currently, even with all the improvements in infant formula composition and the addition of some optional ingredients, there are differences in health and developmental outcomes of infants fed human milk versus infant formula. And as has been mentioned, we know that human milk is a complex, dynamic biological system. What hasn't been mentioned is that the components exist in a matrix. And some ingredients, for example, the addition of something like MFGM is in some ways trying to recapitulate a bit of that matrix. But the matrix of human milk and infant formula are quite distinctly different. We know that the human milk changes during lactation, so questions are around, well, what's an appropriate level to add? For many nutrients like DHA and ARA, we add population mean levels, but that's not necessarily what a breastfed infant individually is seeing. And I think another thing to keep in mind is the potential to interact within the matrix and within the milk. And as formula companies have moved forward with adding optional ingredients, we're seeing different ingredients being added to different formulas at different levels. And so it becomes very difficult from a scientific perspective to really understand the true effects. And even from preclinical and even clinical studies, many of them have not been very large. And then I think that we do have some evidence, and was mentioned human milk oligosaccharides and others, that do show that if we do add synthetic or non-human components, that they can impact developmental outcomes. So there is evidence to suggest that the addition of these components, even within the matrix of infant formula, can have beneficial effects on the infant. So I was kind of building off of Minky's question about, what are the fundamental questions that we need to address before bioactive ingredients are included in infant formula. And, this is something I think that's kind of motivated the INSC from the beginning. And I look at it as, are there reproducible and clinically relevant outcomes associated with the addition of the ingredient? What are the appropriate forms and concentrations needed for said bioactivity? What are appropriate models to assess bioactivity? Prior to clinical trials, we're seeing globally a movement away from animal models to NAMs, and I think that we really need to move cautiously into that space. And, what are the appropriate biomarkers for preclinical and clinical studies? Are there, again, robust and reproducible non-invasive biomarkers for clinical trials that can get beyond to some of these potentially functional outcomes, such as brain neurocognitive development, et cetera.
I'd like to invite the panelists to all just unmute. And Cypress, we can go back to Sharon's slide. Actually, that's a good place for us to stop for a moment. Yeah, Paul, Menke, Dennis, any comments on this foundational scientific question that we're hearing from both Sharon and Menke on appropriate testing or questions that still need to be addressed for bioactive ingredients?
So maybe I'll start with the safety question. So I think when I look at the IOM guidance that was established in 2004, they specifically call out in that document that they considered potential bioactive ingredients, including proteins and peptides, in the development of the framework. So I think there are some of those tools that already exist to evaluate safety. So, I really like what Menke said when she was talking about operationally, how is this going to impact what we do? And when you look at that IOM guidance, even though they do say the guidance was developed specifically with those bioactive ingredients in mind, they also specifically did not create any decisions that were based on that. So it still went back to a case-by-case analysis of, regardless of what that ingredient is, you would still do a case-by-case analysis of, okay, what are the reasonable ways that this could interact with the physiological system? And they didn't really care if that was an essential nutrient or a technological additive or an optional bioactive ingredient.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
kind of,
if I could just jump in, Cypress, I think, from an FDA regulatory perspective, the decision on approving the use of the ingredient in infant formula would be based on a safety decision. It would not be a safety benefit or a risk benefit analysis. It would be purely safety. And this is important because with the drug, it's a risk benefit analysis. So you're accepting some risk from the bioactivity, if you will. The other thing I would point out is when reviewers look at substances that claim to have some effect on the body, bioactivity and toxicology for that are both driven by exposure and mode of exposure. So bioactivity claim is a signal for the reviewers, the safety reviewers, to look more deeply in what is that bioactivity and what does that bioactivity mean from a safety perspective.
I wonder if we can push on that just a little bit. Maybe, we've been talking about bioactive ingredients as defined by their function within the body. And I know that we'll get into safety versus suitability a bit later in this conversation, but just kind of addressing some of these questions that Sharon put on that we're looking at here on the screen. What is the relevance of maybe determining benefit or determining function or demonstrating that within a clinical, preclinical study as it pertains to safety? Or are those two things not linked here? As what we're hearing from both Dennis and Paul is that safety is priority in our understanding of the addition of these ingredients or the permission of adding these ingredients to infant formula. And yet this term is really hinged around its function and its benefit in the infant. So, maybe from each of you, Sharon, I know from an academic perspective, safety is not necessarily considered in the same lens as, someone like Paul does, but for you, perhaps looking at the bioactivity is really more of a priority from an academic perspective. But I wonder just like, how can we bring these both parts of this term together in this conversation?
Well, safety is penultimate, right? Even if something was functional, we wouldn't add it to any food if there were safety concerns. Again, I think Dennis's comment about, drug. So as we think about these functional ingredients, are we attributing in some ways almost drug-like effects to them? And the regulators can push back on that. I guess as I'm looking at this and why I don't call them nutrients, for example, we're not adding lactoferrin to infant formulas as a source of amino acids, right? We know that ultimately it might be digested, but we're hoping it's going to be doing something else before it gets digested and contributing amino acids. So, when safety is first, I'm looking to some sort of a function, but I also think that we need to come up with a standard set, a definition and criteria. And why I'm saying that is that we're seeing different regulatory agencies looking at the same ingredient, looking at the same dossier and clinical and preclinical studies, and coming up with different assessments on safety as well as function, right? So what is the function? What's the concern? And how long do we have to follow an infant to be completely convinced that there isn't going to be some functional effect that's going to result in a safety concern down the road? Okay, because that's not how growth trials, growth studies are organized and conducted. And so where we're having issues, I think, if we can get around a definition, then we can get around the criteria for what the studies need to be done to assess the safety concerns. Because to me, that seems like and since most infant formulas are multinational and distributed in many countries, it seems coming to some sort of standard acceptance among regulatory. So I think so Paul, you were talking about the JC. That does seem like it is something that many regulatory agencies are on. So there is some agreement, but I think that was another motivation for starting this process and understanding that the interpretation of even the scientific evidence is being looked at through different lenses. And so it is curtailing innovation in this space.
Paul or Maggie?
Yeah, it's nutrition science is based on imperfect evidence, right? And especially infant nutrition science. There's only so much you can study in terms of what these long-term impacts would be for the infant when you're giving them something in an infant formula like 10, 20 years down the road. As much as we all like to do like the super long-term follow-up study, I think the practicalities of it limit that. And so it has to be based off of mechanistic understanding, like some of the studies that Sharon has posed here. But to kind of extrapolate, based on what we know today, we don't think or do think that this could be harmful or not harmful.
Yeah, maybe I'll build a little bit too on what Dennis brought up. So that, so if you have an ingredient like lactoferrin that Sharon mentioned that may have some potential benefit through a specific mechanism, I totally agree. Like that should be a trigger that these are therefore the endpoints that you would want to look at to demonstrate safety. So because it has a potential impact on a specific physiological endpoint, that's where you would have that reasonable thought to look and target those safety studies. Just like with xanthan gum, where it's this long polymer, okay, well, what is the most reasonable place or where are the reasonable places you would think it to have an effect? And then we would pick those endpoints because of that. I don't see it really as any different from that approach. The endpoints will be different. And that I also think what we are also seeing is a little bit of a blending of the assessment of benefit and safety. And I think it would be helpful to draw a much clearer distinction between here's the evidence we have, and we're going to consider that only in the scope of is this ingredient safe or not? And that is what the existing programs we have today do to evaluate safety, either through the food additive petition process or the GRAS process. It is really looking at safety, like Dennis said, without consideration of benefit. If there is also a need to look at, is this beneficial? I think I'm not going to comment on one way or another. Do we need to establish that? But I do think it's a very different scientific question that while they may use a common data set, at least pieces of a common data set, answering those questions, if you try to do them at the same time as part of the same assessment, then it becomes very complicated. Whereas if we are very specifically looking at what is this physiologically going to happen, is that going to impact safety? I think that's a much more straightforward exercise.
I agree.
If I could jump in and just build on something Mankey said, under the statute, the safety standard for food additives and grass substances is a reasonable certainty of no harm. It's not absolute certainty of no harm. And there's some information now you're seeing in the ultra processed food space, and I don't want to really get into that, but the fact that post approval you can begin to see adverse effects associated with the use of particular additives or substances in food is information that you could never have pre-market. It's just not available, and to make that decision on a pre-market side. So, I mean, the agencies, the regulatory authorities, have to be willing to accept some risk and not making decisions based on absolute certainty of no harm, because that will never be the case, and it will stifle innovation in not only in the infant formula space but in the food space. So the agencies, the regulatory authorities, have to keep in mind what the safety standard is in terms of developing their policies around these compounds.
Thanks, Dennis. Mankey, did you have any further comments on this?
No, I think yeah, Dennis brought up that really good point, that reasonable certainty of no harm that we're all familiar with, but it's actually applying that in the context of bioactives.
Okay, we're gonna advance the slides a little bit, Cypress, to our question for the panelists. Yeah. So let's pause here for just a moment and hear from the panelists, regarding the use of this term. Do you think it is useful or beneficial with regards to infant nutrition in any of these sectors, essentially looking at food ingredient safety regulations, which is what we were just discussing, looking at academic research or research priorities, or even just looking at marketing, looking at structure function claims? Do we feel like this term in particular is beneficial for any of these? Let's start with Sharon.
Yeah. So I don't think the term in general bioactive is going to go away, because as I mentioned, we've been using it in the functional foods for health, plant bioactives for quite some time. But I do think what we're raising today is what is the best way to talk about these ingredients within the context of infant formula. I don't think human milk researchers are going to stop using, bioactive components in human milk. And where, in my earlier responses and in the opinion poll, I think that if we just need to determine, maybe bioactive is not the best term, but what would be a better term for that people could agree upon and would capture this activity beyond just providing an essential nutrient that's required for survival of that infant. I will just comment on the marketing aspect. And what's quite interesting is, I don't know if people sat in on the Stork Speed expert panel, but there was a lot of pushback from parents and physicians that were on that panel on the marketing aspect on infant formulas, with, sort of making these claims. And, Dennis and others can comment about, regulatory aspects around claims. But I think as we move forward, there's a very good possibility that in the future, there may be a pushback on the types of claims that are being made on infant formulas. And so if that isn't curtailed in some way, then what's the advantage really of using the term bioactive? We'll come later into some of the other alternatives for that. I haven't found one that I really love yet, but we have a great audience. Maybe we'll have some great suggestions from the listeners.
No, there's an idea. Anyone who has a useful definition for us to consider, we should put it in the Q&A or in the chat. That would be great. Dennis, if you're able to unmute and share your perspective on the usefulness of this term bioactive in any of these three areas.
Yeah, so my perspective is jaded because I'm looking at it from a regulatory perspective. And so, and especially in terms of the food additive review, food additive safety considerations. So for me, it has no value in terms of making a safety decision other than identifying potential areas where my reviewers would need to look more closely about what are these biological activities and how does that impact our safety decision. Okay. My view, and I was never really involved in labeling at FDA. I specifically avoided it because I just thought it was very confusing, and I wasn't really, my mindset was not one that would be able to add constructive inputs. But I do think there is within the Codex standard for infant formula, there is a category of optional ingredients that are it is a neutral category in terms of nutrition or food additive, and I think this might be a solution going forward. And I say this because the Codex standards are agreed upon internationally, collectively. There's a consensus globally on what the name or the wording should be. So it may be that we already have a solution right in front of us that we could use. Those are my 2 cents.
That's great. It's going to lead into our next discussion in just a minute. Menke.
Yeah, I would agree with Sharon and Dennis. I don't think it's useful from a safety evaluation standpoint, and actually I think it's probably causing more confusion than anything because it's the expectation that we must have a full understanding of all the functionalities of a given ingredient before they can be considered safe. So it's kind of like melding that functionality and safety evaluation. And it's an unrealistic bar to achieve, right? Like as Dennis noted earlier, the safety standard is reasonable certainty of no harm. But I guess tying back to the marketing aspect too, US is maybe one of the few places in the world that you can currently make structure function claims on front of pack, and that leads to then questions about suitability. Or maybe not suitability, but like the actual benefits and if they are really substantiated. So if those marketing claims and structure function claims go away, does that make the assessment of the true safety aspect of it easier? I don't know, but food for thought.
And Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo that. I don't think it's very helpful in terms of safety assessments because I think we're always considering the potential physiological effects of any ingredient. So I don't think that helps. I think where it could come in to be somewhat helpful is if you were to take those 3 buckets that I talked about at the top, essential nutrients, technological additives, and then this third category, let's call them optional ingredients for now. Like the thinking about how you would frame up your rationale for adding an ingredient to infant formula, it's pretty clear for essential nutrients. I think it ends up being relatively straightforward for technological additives. Does it actually work as a stabilizer or an antioxidant? How do you treat this last category of optional ingredients? And I also really like the Codex definition. It gives a little bit of structure to here are some considerations for these optional ingredients and what you would want to be able to demonstrate, but creating a little more structure and criteria around what hurdles does an ingredient have to meet to be able to demonstrate that, we would say that it could be used as an optional ingredient.
I'm going to pause and have Cypress open our first poll. So it's the same question we're asking our audience members, and when this poll is open, it just became active. We'd love to hear from you to answer the same question. Select any of the sectors or all of the sectors you think the term bioactive is useful or beneficial with regards to infant nutrition. And we'll leave this poll open for just a minute. While this is going, I'm just going to speak for a second from my background in industry is from the startup world where I was part of a few different companies that focus on single ingredients. And I remember in our very early INSC kind of brainstorming meetings with our industry sponsors, one of the questions was, should we really focus on bioactives, or can we just remove this term altogether from this, coalition directives? And a few of us from the startup realm basically said, it is not in our interest to join a coalition that is not focused on a bioactive ingredient, because that really is the defining characteristic of our ingredient. And how we are able to, keep our company alive is by talking about this ingredient as being differentiating from all others because of its unique bioactivity. So I think kind of from different perspectives, it's interesting to hear the impact of this term and, what would happen if it really did go away. Okay, I think I talked our way through the poll. Let's just see the results here. I think our audience is a little heavier on the academic side from the sectors that you represent, but it looks like, yeah, in academic research, this term still is seeming to be very useful in maybe considering research priorities. And then we have almost 50% agreed with in the marketing structure function claims, whereas much fewer are looking at the value of using this with regards to safety regulations and other. And Cypress, I'm not sure how to access the responses, or maybe it's in the chat itself. Actually, and that leads us to, we have a little bit of time for audience questions, and we had an interesting one that was posed about ethics. So, we've been talking about, just going to get this off my screen. So we've been talking about safety evaluations, we've been talking about benefit, and at least in safety evaluations, we have reasonable certainty of no harm as the standard that we're looking at. But, the question arises about ethics. So if we see, for example, the addition of lactoferrin or HMOs or osteopontin or any of these, bioactive components of human milk to be significantly beneficial to the infant, and of course, in our current regulations, as we've discussed already, we cannot do what drug evaluations do, which is a risk-benefit analysis. Is there any point where ethics are considered here in looking at these beneficial outcomes in infants who receive these ingredients versus those that do not? Thoughts from
I can talk to that, speak to that. Yeah, and I think that's, again, from my academic scientific perspective, I agree. I mean, right now, from a regulatory perspective, from my view, infant formula is looked at, it's, reasonable certainty of safety, but we still know that there's functional differences. So, rather than thinking infant formula is good enough, and the risk is adding these bioactive ingredients, which might actually narrow that gap in developmental outcomes between formula-fed and breastfed infants. I agree that this is where I'm talking about the innovation. So I think safety, I think suitability, and we'll talk about this with Codex, is like, yes, is it a component in human milk? But again, that 2004 IOM report said you can't just simply say it's in human milk, it should be an infant formula, right? So that's suitability, but that's not essentiality. We have to go through these other steps, particularly if we're using ingredients from species, other milk of other species, or fermentation. So, I agree. I think that by curtailing the addition of these ingredients, we are depriving some infants from potential benefit. I also, and this can probably come up later too, but while I think we're kind of internally had talked about optional ingredients, I mean, that's already kind of a category that we're using, but it's also communicating that these are still optional. So if there is a placeholder for the addition of these bioactives as optional, is there a runway to them becoming recommended? And I don't think we can ever call them essential without really robust data, but if they stay optional, then you're going to still be having infants that aren't going to be benefiting from any of these. Just like we still have infant formulas without DHA. I mean, and that's pretty critical. So I think that as we move to potentially not using bioactive within that context, is that going to be a permanent criteria, or are there outcomes that we could establish that would say, no, we think that this is beyond optional. We believe that infants are benefiting from the addition of this in infant formula, so it at least should be recommended.
I'm curious to hear from you, Dennis, on this idea of having recommended ingredients. And I'm wondering if that should come from some authoritative body,
Yeah.
instead of the FDA, or what FDA considers on that.
Yeah, I think, this discussion with the term is also conflating all these different conditions when the term might be used. So I'm thinking of labeling and marketing versus, within the context of the scientific community, that something has some bioactivity. Those are two very distinct situations. And then the question of an optional ingredient on the label for some of these ingredients, if that was a category, which I don't believe it is. But if moving towards, for labeling purposes, some recommended ingredients, that's a possibility, but it's going to require, I believe, some sort of external expert body like the Institute of Medicine to make these sorts of recommendations to the agency for implementation purposes.
And I guess that kind of goes to actually our first roundtable discussion topic was on consensus. So how do we define consensus? How do we arrive at consensus? Or where does convergence of evidence lead to these types of recommendations? So I'm hoping that as we further our coalition efforts, we can sort of merge these concepts together, and we do find a route forward where we can find understanding of which authoritative body can make these types of recommendations and what is the threshold of evidence that's needed for consensus among scientific experts. Let's move forward. We have a few other topics to cover. I know we've already used some of these terms, but let's just put these definitions here. So Paul and Sharon, have you been kind of using these phrases, essential versus optional? Actually, everyone has here in the room. But I just want to put these up from Codex. These are definitions we pulled directly out of a couple of different documents. And you can see I've emphasized a few things here to differentiate these, on specifically looking at optional versus essential. For essential, I mean, this is looking at essential composition. So infant formula is a product based on milk of cows or other animals, or mixture thereof, and or ingredients which have been proven to be suitable for infant feeding. Suitability is another term that we've been kind of floating around, but let's look first at this term essential. The nutritional safety and adequacy of infant formula shall be sufficiently demonstrated to support growth and development of infants. And then for optional, in addition to the compositional requirements listed, other ingredients may be added in order to provide substances ordinarily found in human milk and to ensure that the formulation is suitable as the sole source of nutrition for the infant, or to provide other benefits that are similar to outcomes of populations of breastfed babies. The suitability for the particular nutritional uses for infants and the safety of these substances shall be scientifically demonstrated. The formula shall contain sufficient amounts of these substances to achieve the intended effect, taking into account levels in human milk. So just using these terms, essential versus optional, let's just do a roundtable for a minute and consider, the benefit of this instead of, or in lieu of the term bioactive, or if we can group bioactive into these optional ingredients. This is a secondary question, but Cypress, let's just go back to that definition slide for just a minute. Dennis, do you want to start here of looking at these terms, optional versus essential, and the benefit of using these, or how we can fit bioactives into this?
Yeah, at this point, I'm thinking optional is the best fit for the bioactive compounds, but it may be that we could come up with a different category, such as recommended, that is not necessarily nutritional uses, but it is important for the substance to be in the infant formula for beneficial purposes, and developmental needs or whatever biological function that bioactive compound is providing. So maybe we need a different category.
Yeah.
I mean, I like the definition of optional ingredient as well. And I think Mankey said it at the beginning. Whether or not something has enough evidence to demonstrate that it is recommended to be added to infant formula, I think we have the example of DHA that it took a very long path from, this is something that they found, and then they continued to build up that the evidence that there was a benefit until the point where I think I know in Europe it is mandatory to be included in at least some infant formulas. So like I see optional ingredient being able to kind of serve as that umbrella. And I like a lot of the elements in that definition. And I think it also highlights another difference between what is table stakes for all infant ingredients, which is demonstrating safety. And in those cases, you're always setting a maximum level. So this is the level above which we cannot guarantee the safety. What we're talking about in that optional ingredient definition is actually setting a minimum as well. So it's not only do we think that there is evidence that demonstrates that this component could be beneficial to infant nutrition if it's in infant formula, and then what also would be the minimum level that you would need to add. So certainly it will always be critical to set a maximum for these ingredients, I mean, to ensure safety. But I do think that second element at the bottom does bring in like, okay, in these cases, if you're evaluating, does it meet the definition of optional ingredient? Does that come along with setting a minimum?
That's a very provocative thought right there. Mankey, I'm going to put you on the spot for a minute representing HMOs, because I know from an academic perspective, and this conversation happens everywhere, the levels of HMOs are really, really, really relevant to demonstrate that intended effect. And some have argued that the levels that are permitted for infant formula are not at the level that's needed to demonstrate the significant beneficial effect. What are your thoughts on this idea of setting a minimum and demonstrating, that minimum level that's needed, and how does this pertain to HMOs?
The minimum concept, I think, comes from the essential nutrients, right? Where you know that if you don't have that compound in the diet of the infants, there's going to be some overt signs of deficiency. But when it comes to these optional ingredients, I think it's clear there is no overt signs of deficiency when they're not present in the diet of the infants. So I think it's maybe it's, even though it's not an overt sign of deficiency, there is still some functional deficit that is in play when it's not present in the diet of the infant, but it's certainly more nuanced, right? And you don't see it with the standard growth tolerance trials that are done today, for instance. And, levels of human milk components are definitely not static, whereas they absolutely are static in an infant formula product. So it's how do you, that's the broader question of the INSE. How do you use that human milk composition and the fluctuation in levels to draw the static level that should be added into a formula product?
Sharon, I'd love to hear from you on the same question.
Yeah. And I think like focusing on the HMOs, clearly, more clinical trials and even moving into products, we're seeing formulas with 5 to 6 HMOs and levels up closer to 5 grams per liter, which would be kind of at the lower end of human milk. And we are seeing more beneficial effects, for example, on bifidobacteria. So if we were to say, yeah, having a microbiome that more closely resembles the human infant, or having, an immune outcomes that more closely resemble the human infant. So this is, I think, where we're not going to get to this today, but I think this is kind of the direction that we're trying to think about. That is, as we think about what are we trying to encapsulate by bioactive, functional, optional, whatever we use. But I think a lot of us do like this codex definition because it has a lot of those elements. What would be that criteria, that would say, do we think that it's really important that infants have more bifidobacteria, or more Bifidobacterium infantis, or another strain that even Bacteroides that can now been shown to use HMOs. So it's we need the research, and we need the questions to drive the research. And I'll also say this whole idea of a minimum, very few. So I do piglet studies, and companies, formula companies, as well as ingredient companies, come to me and hardly anybody wants to do dose responses. They'll either come with, this is what we're going to add, test this, or maybe 2 doses. But, right now there's not a lot of evidence that would allow us to set a minimum level. And we're looking at different companies that have done their own studies that they need for regulatory. And it's like the probiotic space. You're always comparing apples and oranges because everybody's using different bugs at different strains at different doses because you don't want to use exactly what your competitor is using. And so how the industry and the marketing is approaching this is very different than how we as a scientist would like to design that study that would help us to provide that evidence that could help inform what's a minimum level. But I will say in my last comment that I do think that these conversations are very timely with at least what's going on in the US with actually going back and looking at infant formula nutrient recommendations. And we'll be reevaluating those and setting minimums and maximums. And so, to begin to interject that thinking into other ingredients, it may actually happen that if people are adding lactoferrin already, and that's, there may actually be recommendations at some point about what that minimum or even maximum level should be.
Thank you. And one of your early comments, I think, will lead us directly into this next slide, Cypress. And Cypress, I think we can go ahead and open this poll too. This is another poll to the audience, but also to our panelists. So Sharon had mentioned kind of when, what's the threshold of evidence that would be needed to, bring an ingredient to recommended. This is a little bit of a different where we're saying what would drive the recategorization of an optional ingredient to an essential ingredient. But similar concept. Let's hear from our panelists while the audience is polling. Anyone want to jump in with comments on this? Or I'll pull you out. Mankey.
Sorry, I missed that. What did she say?
But just looking at this question of what's the threshold of scientific evidence that would drive that recategorization from optional to essential?
Ooh, so I mean, I don't think it's a dichotomous concept. I think it's, the evidence base is going to grow as, time happens. That's inevitable. I think once the ingredient has been determined safe and is commercialized, that incentivizes more research to take place. And then we add more understanding to what we know about what these ingredients are doing. And maybe at some point, the evidence is so compelling that these things are playing a critical role to infant development and health that, they do become essential in a way. But then, there is the regulatory part of actually making that ingredient and transitioning it from an optional status to something that absolutely needs to be in an infant formula product. And that crossover is a regulatory change, and that can take a lot of time in practice. If you look at the DHA example, for instance, I think it was 30 plus years before it got mandated in the EU. And even then, there is maybe some debate still about its functionalities, and so it's going to continue to grow. Our knowledge is going to continue to grow as science develops.
Yeah, we see the audiences alongside you. Mankey, we got almost 50-50 on these two top ones, demonstrating demonstration of deficiency and demonstration of benefit. But I guess going back to what we had just discussed, maybe what we're talking about here is when the evidence pushes an optional ingredient into a recommended ingredient, right? Along what you were saying,
Yeah.
Sharon. So
Yeah.
perhaps we should rephrase this question a little bit. And maybe Paul, I think when we were talking about this, before this, I think maybe you would propose that there will never be a moment that a bioactive would ever be required or an essential ingredient.
And to me, I think there's a difference between the definition of essential and then also, what is your permission from a regulatory perspective for addition to a product? So I actually like the definition of essential being limited to only those substances where you see a gross deficiency. But And for a DHA as an example, like I would still consider that an optional ingredient under the Codex definition, even though it's required in the EU to be added to infant formula. I think you can still have a recommendation and even a regulatory requirement to add an ingredient, even if there isn't a gross deficiency, if it's not there, if the demonstrated benefit is high enough that you are bringing infant formula closer to the function of human milk by its presence. So, it's a broader public health initiative, honestly, at that point of saying, the evidence is so great, even though there's no deficiency, we still recommend all products include that. So I do see it just they're slightly different concepts. And I don't think you ever would get to essential for some of these things that are optional today.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I almost would see in a perfect world that we would have criteria to move in even into an optional category. And then as more evidence accumulates, then maybe you could move into a recommended. Because again, as a purist nutrition person, I don't think that the term essential, but we do see in infants that some nutrients are conditionally essential in infancy, because again, when I look at DHA, I think the evidence was the strongest for the preterm infants, and it was not as strong for term infants. And now recent evidence in the personalized nutrition space shows infants with different SNPs, benefit more from the addition in the diet than others. And so, science moves on. I liked Menke's comment about, essentiality could change as we understand more actions of nutrients beyond the, oh, you don't have scurvy, you're fine types of things. So, I think that we need to be flexible. And I think part of the recommendations, even in infant formula nutrients, is, we can't wait 50 years to reassess these. Can we have a rolling cycle within every 5 years or a reasonable amount of time that these values are reassessed? But in the meantime, there's the opportunity to consider new innovative products. But I don't think we can require them or call them essential, but I think they can be recommended based on the evidence. And that could, like I think even a 2-stage process, looking at suitability, reasonable certainty of no harm, robust safety assessments. But, we do believe more bifidobacteria is better. We do believe cytokine secretion is better, or, immune cell composition. Like we just published a paper doing, single cell RNA-seq on PBMCs from breastfed and formula-fed infants, and you see big differences. As that science evolves, is that due to ingredients that are missing from formula, or ingredients that are in formula? So that's the thing. It's not just what's missing, it's just the composition is different.
Cypress, let's advance to our safety versus suitability slide. This will be the last topic that we'll cover here, because we've already touched on these, and this is the same definition we looked at before from Codex, looking at essential versus optional. But this time, I want the panelists to really zone in on or hone in on this difference between demonstration of safety versus demonstration of suitability. And Paul, I'm going to ping you from, Rob's been putting in some of the chats here, talking about the IOM 2004 report. Why don't you just give kind of help us with this framework of looking at a suitability versus safety evaluation and considering the existing guidelines we have in place.
Yeah, so and this really is a lot of my comments pushing to, these are two very different things which may use similar data sets. But in 2004, IOM put together this really nice guidance where it laid out a set of 7 decision trees, and I love a good decision tree, and it talked through, here is how you would set up a safety program to demonstrate the safety of an infant formula ingredient. And as I said before, it doesn't make any differentiation of why are you adding this. It is not meant to be an evaluation of, does it have a benefit if you add it to the product? It is really laser focused on, does the data that exists support the safety of this ingredient under conditions of use? So can you reach that hurdle of reasonable certainty? And it sets up a framework where you're starting with some of those traditional preclinical toxicology studies, like I described with xanthan gum and ascorbyl palmitate, where you start with those non-targeted methods. Do you have effects on any mammalian system? And then using information about the characterization of the ingredient to design specific studies to address specific questions. It has different tiers where, if you see something in an early tier, you would run a follow-up that would be answer specific questions that arose. I think it's really robust. And I did see the question in the chat too, like, do we already have consensus around how you would evaluate safety? I think that IOM paper, science does evolve, per Mankey's comment, like not just in nutrition, but also in toxicology. I think it's probably worth a once over on that guidance document to see if we have, let's say, better models that are already in place that we could leverage. But I think it's a really good starting point that probably gets us 98% of the way there. And again, to reinforce, I don't think consideration of is something bioactive or not really helpful in the context of thinking about safety. So like, I don't think you see that in that IOM guidance. I would highly predict that if we did do a reevaluation of the applicability of that guidance, I don't think it would then say, oh, there's a special path for bioactives. I think it would continue to be case-by-case analysis based on what we know about the substance.
And Dennis, over to you on safety versus suitability. Thanks, Paul, for that overview of IOM. Dennis, thoughts from you on differentiating the benefit of differentiating safety versus suitability? And also, Dennis, I wonder if you can speak from your knowledge on the FDA side, if these terms are actually used on the regulatory considerations of ingredients.
So generally from the food additive space, suitability is not part of the consideration. The related to this though is misleading the consumer. If the use of the additive would mislead the consumer and under its conditions of use, and this is often used from the USDA side when people are thinking about adding colors to meat and poultry products and trying to mislead the consumer in terms of the freshness of the product. But generally, the use of the additive, if it's declared in the ingredient labeling statement, its use is not misleading to the consumer. So it's somewhat related to suitability, but it's not quite suitability. The other thing I wanted to point out, if you recall my slide when I made my initial comments, the definition of infant formula does use the expression suitable, whether the composition is suitable for infant formula. So suitability is considered, I think, as part of the infant formula review process, but not necessarily in terms of the review that the food additives group would look at in terms of the ingredient safety perspective. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, interesting. I guess, Sharon, you've used this term too. Any last thoughts on the differentiation of safety versus suitability?
I'm going to say no, just because of time. I think I've commented previously.
We are towards the end of this. We'll put up one more audience poll here on this differentiation here. Do we feel, as a scientific community represented here in our audience, that there's a usefulness in separating the discussions of safety versus suitability of an ingredient? And I know we're not asking you from your particular sector, not differentiating if you are from the academic world or industry or regulatory, but I think it's an interesting test of this audience. And it looks pretty clear already that we say, yes, it is beneficial to demonstrate or to talk about these things differently, the safety of an ingredient versus its suitability for usefulness in infant formula. Interesting. All right, that was great. So some alignment here. All right, we are at the bottom of the hour, just about done with this really great roundtable discussion. I'm going to open it up to our panelists to just say, if there's one key takeaway that you want to really emphasize, in 1 minute or less for each of you, what would it be? And if you want to say if there are still significant gaps, which I think is pretty obvious that we need to address before we can align on consensus for this term. We'll start at the top again, Dennis, and move our way down our panelist list. Dennis, any key takeaways here?
Yeah, I think my big key takeaway is in terms from a regulatory perspective, the use of the phrase bioactive sort of muddles the discussion. And if the discussion could be centered on safety, that the term would be more helpful. Some other alternative term would be more helpful. Bioactive just sort of raises red flags on the safety set for the safety assessment.
Menke? Thanks, Paul. Or sorry, thanks, Dennis. Menke?
Yeah, I know we said this a lot already today, but unknowns are inevitable. We're never going to fully know exactly what everything is doing in human milk, how they're interacting, what levels. Like those questions are always going to be there in the background to some degree. So it's getting to a place, and I like what Paul was saying too about separating safety versus suitability, and those are just the basis for those questions are based on the same data set, but it's teasing that apart using a systematic and pragmatic approach, perhaps like the IOM decision tree. What are the must knows and what are the nice to knows?
Thank you, Menke. Paul?
Yeah, I think I'll just go back to kind of saying that again. So I also don't think that bioactive helps at all when you're doing a safety determination, but that isn't because we're not interested in the potential physiological effects. But I think my argument is that we're always considering the reasonable physiological effects of every substance. So why give it a label that indicates that these are the only ones we're going to look at physiological effects when in fact we're actually looking at the reasonably potential physiological effects of all ingredients. So I agreeing with Dennis' comments that I think it muddles that, but it may be important to have a different way of evaluating, is it suitable?
And Sharon?
Yeah, I would agree. I was taken by Dennis and Paul's comments about, there are some frameworks in place. And obviously everything has to have the safety, and by knowledge of what purported other activity this component might have, that can lead the appropriate study for, the safety assessment as well. I would say in terms of gaps, I still think that when INSC formed, this was part of our question, but part of it is we're hoping to continue to drive research around human milk composition, functions of these ingredients. And, for a long time, funding out of NIH has been pretty paltry. We had a little bit of a blip with the begin, and it seemed like we would have some funding, but, what then happens is that much of the funding for human milk and lactation research either has been coming from the Gates Foundation or industry. And anything from industry is tainted in the eyes of many people. So I would say the gaps are, we still don't know a lot about human milk. And that's keeping us from asking the right questions around safety, but also forming that evidence base that would move ingredients into recommended space. And I do think that as we also look at the sources, that's going to be, once we think we should add them, what are the sources and all the additional considerations. So I think there's frameworks. I really like going back to the 2004. I think looking at how we currently are assessing safety, there's a place to go, but we also, need to be understanding more about the components so we can frame the correct studies. And, INSC will be moving forward in some of these other questions that I brought up. So I hope that all of you are coming along with us through this whole process.
Perfect way to end this. Cypress, you want to pull up the very last slide with our QR code. Thank you to all of our panelists and for all of our audience members for participating in our live polls and discussions. As a reminder, this session has been recorded and will be posted to our website, the inscoalition.org. And please make sure you join the coalition's mailing list to stay up to date with all of our activities. And we will be following up. Actually, it'll come from Scipinion, but Scipinion will be sending out a poll for all of our audience members to participate in following today's discussion. So please keep a lookout for that. And yeah, thank you. Have a great day, everyone.